Okay, why don't we get going? Um, as you all know, I'm Dave Gustin. I'm the director of the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. And this is our final enlightening lunch of this very challenging spring semester. I want to thank everybody and congratulate everybody for being here and for managing to survive this far and for, bellying up for the last of these enlightening lunches. And we have a real treat today. We have Kyle Whyte here to talk to us about the timing of Indigenous justice. Kyle is the George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, where he serves as a faculty member in the Environmental Justice specialization. Beyond Kyle's achievements, which I won't go into, I just want to say that I have been familiar with Kyle's work for a long time, since he was part of, Kyle was the original or the second cohort of the winter school that the Center for Nanotechnology and Society ran up at Saguaro Lake. Um, and it was a real joy to get to know Kyle back then and to the original one. So, and to be familiar with his work and really to find it, well, as someone has, I think Sarah already put in the chat, inspiring. That's a hard thing to live up to, Kyle, to be inspiring through this mode of interaction. But we really look forward to your sharing with us today, and I'll turn the rest over to you. As the folks know, the plan is for the presenter to go on for 25, 30 minutes, maybe a few minutes longer, to be open question and answer after that till the top of the hour, and then some more intimate conversation with the doctoral students from the top of the hour down to 1:30. Assuming that Kyle can stay that long. So welcome, Kyle, and thank you so much for your spending time with us today.
Great, Dave, and thanks for the kind introduction. And good to see so many friends and colleagues from ASU. I've had a great relationship with ASU over the years, and it's certainly one of my favorite communities of scholars and around. So it's awesome to have a chance to connect. And for this presentation, given the setup for this lunchtime event, I wanted to provide some thoughts fairly quickly about climate change. And in our discussions, we can take this in a whole bunch of different directions. But what I'm going to do is kind of cut into the middle of some work that I've been doing. I've published a little bit kind of around the edges of this. I've presented a little bit on this as well. But for our lunchtime event, I'm going to cut right into the middle. And so I'm going to briefly tell you a little bit about why I'm thinking about some of these things, and then just get right into some of the different models and approaches that I've been developing. So basically, as someone that works both kind of on the policy side and the science side of Indigenous people's planning for climate change, I've been really concerned about where things are going with the energy transition. I know that's a topic that ASU has been distinguishing itself in terms of supporting work to prepare for the energy transition. And one of the things that's been disturbing is that the testimonies from Indigenous people, the scientific literature, like in fields of political ecology, has pretty much been showing that a lot of the projects for different renewable energy, like solar, wind, or that they've actually been pretty harmful and damaging to Indigenous people. And so part of the challenge is that when these new projects to try to get us to zero carbon or to net zero are being put in place, they're occurring on top of like institutional arrangements that have not been good for Indigenous people, to put it lightly, for many generations. And the people who are proposing these innovations, these renewable energy projects, it's like it doesn't dawn on them that they're playing into these particular dynamics. And I know some of them don't care, but for many people, at least I know, the intentions are very good. And so I've been trying to, as an environmentalist and climate change person myself, I've been trying to come to terms with the fact that we're almost just repeating colonialism again with some of these environmental and climate change advocacy efforts. And so I, as somebody that's involved, especially right now with a lot of work happening in the Biden-Harris administration, it's been particularly concerning to me because right now there's the potential of mobilizing more money than ever before for sustainable infrastructure, for climate change mitigation, and other related types of projects. I mean, well into the billions. And one of the Biden administration's commitments is called Justice 40, which is 40% of those executive branch investments have to go to affected communities and, or communities affected by environmental injustice. So the approach that I've been taking, and I think there's a lot of approaches to this issue, but the approach I've been taking is actually some of the problems start with the fact that actually there is a very narrow conception of climate change that is, currently being used. And so part of my project has been to suggest that there are different Indigenous inspired ways to understanding climate change, which would put some of the issues I mentioned very, very briefly in high relief. So when I think about the way that climate change is kind of commonly understood, this is from the National Climate Assessment. I've been an author for many years on the National Climate Assessment. It's always, climate change is always presented like as a linear phenomena. You either measure it in years or decades or longer than that, but it's always a linear, kind of notion. And like with the IPCC's report on the 1.5 degrees, it's an example of something that makes people want to act urgently about climate change, because they'll say we just have a decade to do something, or 2 decades to do something before we lead to a changes that get us into a lot of dangers. And so it's always about urgency. It's always about figuring out how to take action now, and that there's sort of a ticking clock that we're having to deal with. And so, you get a lot of images like this that try to kind of get us to like appreciate that linearity. And it's tied to this idea that we need to kind of stop our addiction to fossil fuels, and that part of that ticking clock is to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And that's really where the emphasis is that climate change is a phenomena in linear time. And for me to kind of cut to the chase, and again, I'm assuming that we'll have all sorts of time to discuss further and into the details, but it kind of reminds me of the difference between like a speed chess game with a timer and just a chess game without the timer. And then, a speed chase or a speed chess game, you have to make your moves quickly. I mean, if the clock is moving quickly, you have to make your moves quickly, and you have to fall back on like your memory and the things, like in sports, your muscle memory. You have to fall back on that, and so it creates a situation where, for say, nation states or corporations that for hundreds of years have oppressed Indigenous people, if they move quickly to implement renewable energy technology, their muscle memory is colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism. That's what they know best, is how to put stuff in practice without Indigenous people's consent in ways that are economically not reciprocal, and in ways that are not trustworthy. And so intentions, aside, right? That's the muscle memory that we're dealing with regarding the energy transition. You can contrast that with a non-timed game of chess, in which there's way more time to think about all the different strategies and to think about history, but there's also actually time, if you really put it in context, to take care of your health and to make sure you're okay and have a little, chess life balance, so to speak, and to really attend to everything. And I know some of you might be thinking, well, yeah, then the worst, climate change is gonna set in, but that's part of the dynamic I'd like to express here, is that actually part of the problem is that hyper emphasis on addressing climate change at a certain speed, which gives us a sort of seeming or it sort of creates a situation where concerns about fixing equity issues and justice issues are add-ons or things that can be sacrificed for the speed of getting as close as possible to a zero carbon energy system. So what I've tried to contrast is that actually there's way more ways to talk about climate change than the ones that are most dominant out there. And so I've been working on some different ways to just narrate the problem of climate change, from indigenous philosophies. So these are some of the time narrative approaches that I've been developing. And for some of you who have seen, versions of these, I've been going kind of more in depth. And in the field of indigenous studies, which I think is really one of the most exciting fields right now, we have amazing contributions that I've also been building on. Mark Rifkin's work and Grace Dillon's work and Heather Davis and Zoe Todd's work and others as well, right? And indigenous artists like Nanaba Becker's Sixth World and Dennis Goulet's Awakening. I mean, these are all amazing artistic contributions to some of these questions. And so one of the ways I've been trying to carve this up is that we first need to start from a particular historical perspective, because similar, if you've read the work of Candace Callison, they asked some pretty powerful questions about indigenous perspectives on climate change, where there's no reason that any indigenous person would have the same touchstones for what climate change means. Right, in terms of some of these narratives that the knowledge of the greenhouse gas effect starts in the 19th century, and then in the 70s and 80s, climate scientists begin to understand some of the relationships between what was currently the cause behind increases in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and so on. Is that perspective on climate change need not be the dominant one. And so if we look at like the green, which represents like a couple hundred years, and the red, which is like a couple thousand years, for a lot of indigenous folks, right, the industrial era, so say if we're talking about the United States, US settlement, that's a pretty small part of our history. And so the first thing just to note, right, is that if the green parts refer to different times in which we've been, settled or colonized, we know that that's happened before, and we're currently in this period, right? But we've got a bigger history, and the bigger history is what continues. And we also know that our societies, shaped and changed and dealt with complexity all throughout those histories. So it's not like there's some kind of like tribal identity that like one family that persisted for 2,000 years. We know that it's been about change, and there's been narration and so on. And so first of all, it's important to note that a lot of climate change discussions are about risks to the industrial period, right? The one that so many of us take for granted as providing the basis for what seems to be normal to us, right? Where normal or normalcy is a very problematic thing to claim. And so it's important to note that for us, right, this is where we're at, and we're not hoping that this continues. We're hoping that ends pretty soon. And so, if you separate out conceptions of time, colonial and indigenous, for example, to put it in binary terms, for a lot of my colleagues, their conception of history, to me at least, when I interpret it, is that the last several hundred years, like that's what, where all the emphasis is. Like if I recall my educational experiences at different stages, almost everything was about like stuff that happened since the United States was founded. And there's some strange, murky history that we're exposed to. There's stuff about the Vikings and the Romans and the Greeks and the Dark Ages, right? But pretty much you get all this emphasis on like the industrial period. And obviously that's where a lot of literature and documentation and rhetoric and all that was produced. But it's portrayed in a way, right, when in these climate change discussions, right, that what we're trying to protect, it seems to me, is that period. There's an urgency to protect that period, and not really much about what came before it. Whereas actually for Native folks, this isn't the first time, and I've heard this from so many different tribes. I mean, I know there's always exceptions because there's so many different Indigenous people and cultures, but I've been around like all over the world, and so many Native folks from different parts of the world, they say the same thing, though obviously in totally different terms. But we've been threatened by climate change before. Um, and if you look at this model, right, there's all these past periods of climate change over the course of 1,000 years. I mean, depending on the indigenous people, and there's different stories. Melissa Nelson at ASU has a good article. I'll send you all the link for it that touches on this that I use and cite in some of my recent work about Anishinaabe stories about climate change, and Nelson focuses on stories about Mizu Piju. And so here, right, we know that there are these periods. They might have lasted 100 years or so when climate change happened. And in some of the stories, in some of the stories, it was kind of climate change as something that like the environment did, and humans had to figure out how to respond. But in other stories, there are things that humans did wrong, or there are instances where the climatic change was tied to conflicts. And so you have like all different historic stories talking about different types of causation, but the idea of anthropogenic climate change is not something that's associated only with the current time, but it's something that you can reach back in the past and find those instances of. And so if you look at a lot of Native stories, what's important to note, and this kind of ties back to the topic I started with, is I've never seen a Native story yet that said that the solution to how you deal with climate change or the lesson learned is an innovation, like a technological innovation. Certainly the stories might have different types of knowledge or innovation that occur, but the moral of the story is never that what gets through people through the climate change period is that a new technology came about, and then people just got really urgent and just implemented it everywhere to avert catastrophe. I just haven't seen a story that's like that. Instead, the stories actually usually talk about kinship lessons, like the reason why it was hard to be resilient or hard to respond, or the reason why there was conflict was because people, as well as non-humans, depending on the tradition, they forgot what it meant to be reciprocal. They forgot what it meant to be trustworthy. They forgot what it meant to be consensual. They forgot what it meant to be accountable. In a word, right, they forgot those qualities of mutual responsibilities. And I call these kinship relationships. There's a lot of different interesting ways to talk about kinship, but one is that kinship relationships are those ones that you have. Oftentimes they're unspoken. Oftentimes they're, like what we would say in English, informal relationships, but they're the relationships that you really need to have that support network to respond to all sorts of different disruptions, from the daily ones, the seasonal ones, to bigger ones like climate change, or to hazards that you can't predict. If you have a strong kinship system, which goes way beyond just your nuclear family, but can extend to all sorts of people, your best friends, people you work with, people you engage with in other ways. If you've got a really kin-centric culture, then you've got a great support network, because consent and trust, those are relationships that really matter when you need them. And they're not ones that you can necessarily establish super quickly. They take time to develop, years, decades. We're talking about a level of a society to get to a point where you go from, say, a society that has no respect for consent to a society that does. That could take a couple generations, actually. Given some of the problems, but anyways, for a lot of Native folks, right, the climate threatened period is this period. If we're talking about the current climate change ordeal, but we're trying to draw on all of these lessons from the past to deal with it. So part of these lessons are things like I said, trust or consent or reciprocity, which are also, in addition to being kinship, highly relevant to justice. And so for us, when we look at this current threatened period, we're actually saying, wait a minute, our lessons teach us that like justice and equity types of concerns should be at the forefront, and not just urgency. And in fact, getting too wrapped up into urgency again creates that state of exception, so to speak, right? It creates that suspension of morality. and that we recognize, right, because some of these periods, like in an image before, were colonial periods, we recognize that most forms of colonialism have good intentions associated with them. That people thought that they were responding positively to a crisis, and oftentimes it was, with supposedly good intentions. We look at different periods of colonialism, they were oftentimes perpetrated by people that, refer to themselves as friends of Native people. They had very benevolent and good names for for who they were, but they were dispossessing us of land, and, breaking up families and brainwashing people in boarding schools. So another model, right, is that actually, right, for us, we're not trying to preserve anything. So in how we respond to climate change, we're not trying to preserve anything, right? Because for us, we're more in like the dystopian time, because we've already seen the collapse of our societies, the dismantling of our social, educational, cultural systems. And so we're in this period of dystopia. And again, it's not one that we want to continue. And so that's why there's so much effort by many different tribes and Native people here and everywhere in the world to try to rekindle and resurge and maintain these traditions of who we are, our continuance. And we know that there's been prior dystopias, right? We've gotten out of prior ones and we're in one now. And so we're not looking to preserve anything, because if the status quo for us is more like a dystopia, at least from our ancestors' perspective, and it's certainly not something that we would be excited to continue. And I think for folks that didn't believe that, they saw it with the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, look at how Indigenous people and people of color and people of other communities that have been treated very poorly, how they were affected disproportionately. And so I used to get really, I still do get disturbed when people say return to normal, because if you're telling me that a time period when Native people and other groups are disproportionately vulnerable to public health crisis is normal, that's not a normal situation. It wasn't normal for many of our ancestors, unless it was during one of those past periods, right? But we don't look on those periods fondly either. But for the industrial period, right, that's actually a fantasy time. And so many of our colleagues within like the settler population or other types of dominant populations, whether that's economically or racially or socially, the industrial period is actually the time that their ancestors, whether direct or just in a theoretical sense, right, they fantasized about, because like, man, in the late 1700s or early 1800s, their ancestors didn't think they could get to this point because there were Indigenous people standing in the way. um, and they would have been, those ancestors would have been like, oh my God, if they were to see how things have become in a situation where, fossil fuel industry can put stuff on Native people's lands, and either there's not a lot we can do about it, or we have to exert tremendous effort just to get like the smallest administrative victory or court victory, or I mean, it just takes a lot out of people to engage in that type of advocacy. And yeah, the colonial ancestors would have been like, wow, that's our wildest dream for our colonial culture to have that level of expansiveness. And so for this reason, right, when we think about something like renewable energy, I think there's a huge difference between renewable energy as a way to preserve today, things that people appreciate about today, and actually renewable energy as a project trying to, it's a tool for getting out of a dystopia. So that's kind of one aspect of it. Another aspect, right, and this is kind of a different topic, but it's highly related, is there's also these different ways to engage in time telling. And for a lot of Indigenous folks, we've been talking a lot about seasonality, and the fact that Indigenous cultures are oftentimes connected to societies that understood that their primary principle of social organization was how is the society supposed to be structured and geared so that it's as adaptive as possible to seasons changing around. around you. And it didn't matter whether you were a tribe that, lived in one way or opposed to another, right? But that there is always kind of a sense of adaptivity and mobility and constant movement and constant, transactions of different kinds throughout the year, because the seasons, the foods, there's change that's constantly happening. And so in some of the work that I've been part of, right, we've been working on kind of this model of, well, how do you tell time without that clock happening, right? And so one of the models that I've been working with is that, and it's kind of a way to get out away from how certain scientists have articulated indigenous knowledge, primarily in terms of information that plugs into scientific reports. But actually, the idea that indigenous knowledge of climate change is not really just knowledges of cues and changes, but it's some of the work that I've been part of that's been led by Samantha Chisholm Hatfield at Oregon State. That whenever folks talk about the cues and the changes, they always refer to collective or coordinated activities. Like nobody says there's a change in a plant, there's a change in a fish. They say, okay, well, when there's a change in a plant, a change in a fish movement, then there's a harvesting activity or a ceremonial activity or some other social activity that goes with it. And so whenever people talk about seasonality, they're talking not just about environmental changes, strictly physical, but also about all the different social activities that go along with it. So it's a way of telling time in which you're telling time and measuring time, not in terms of days or weeks, but in terms of when certain social activities are to take place. Now, for Anishinaabe people that moved around a lot, like in the Great Lakes area, that also meant that society was constantly changing. Sometimes the family unit living in one place was the main kind of governing unit. Other times it was a large band or tribe or lodge that was involved. And so there's all this movement. And for other Indigenous people, it works a bit differently, I would say. But the point being, right, is that you tell time through the flow and change and transformation of social activities. But when you look at a lot of these accounts, right, that flow of social activities is about the kinship relations, like ceremonial relations build, strengthen, renew kinship. And if you take kinship in the way I've been talking about it, as having to do with responsibilities and consent and trust, right? Then as time flows and you're continuing to engage in these activities, that again contributes to improved responsiveness to the cues and changes. And so here then, right, something like climate change is not experienced actually as just a disruption of the environment, and we need to unpack the economic and social aspects of it, or but actually climate change is already a disruption that affects a certain social fabric. And so you experience a disruption not first as a physical disruption, you experience a disruption as a disruption of social activities, because any change in the timing associated with climate change you might experience in a given year through the weather, right, is or other annual changes that occur, is a change that affects that you experience through the change in the coordination of the social activities. And so in that way, it already has the social aspect to it. The social aspect doesn't need to be built in. Nobody needs to be taught that there's also a social science aspect to physical climate science. It's already both. It's already interdisciplinary. And so in this way, right, it immediately becomes apparent that the climate change issue is a kinship issue. And in cases where it's hard to adapt the social activities, and we're experiencing that right now with the United States, it's very hard for tribes and the United States to coordinate together to respond well to climate change for reasons of safety for tribes, of economic vitality, of cultural continuance, precisely because we've been following for a long, long time that there's not been a lot of coordination, to put it lightly, with the United States as Native people are living throughout the year and trying to sustain themselves and so on. And so this is why like tribal colleges and other entities have tried to recreate a sense of these types of seasonal ways of thinking about things. But again, it goes beyond the seasons. And this is the paper where we talk about some of this, though in a little bit of a different form, that you should check out. And so the last thing I'll just mention is just one more sense of time here. But so all of this actually says that, you can just, you can tell time, you can just talk about time without days and years, but you can talk about it just through talking about kinship. And so like a lot of elders or other just storytellers, doesn't matter if they're an elder, they can talk about, thousands of years of history without saying thousands of years. They can talk about ancient stories and transitions across an entire society, just in terms of how kinship relationships have changed. That's important, right? Because it means that a story can both be ancient, but it can also be present too, and be interpreted and used in the present sense, because there's no need to like locate it in like 1601, or or the year 1000 or something like that. But and so people can tell whole histories of talking about kinship relationships, right? And there's an actual, kind of speed of kinship, and kinship escalates and de-escalates, like the periods where the US, at least for some tribes, engaged in heavy invasion. I mean, that was a contraction of kinship, right? In a lot of different levels. But then how do you build back up after that happens? Well, it takes time to do that, especially when you have oppressive forces impinging against you. And so in this way, right, it creates a challenge, and this is just what I'll close with. That, for a lot of Native folks that I really respect, like Mary Arquette, for example, who's a environmental scientist and veterinarian and traditionalist Haudenosaunee person who is active in those landmark efforts to address the pollution in the St. Lawrence River area, and kind of some of the best work by Native people on environmental justice at Akwesasne. But they say stuff like this. This is a hard to find article, but you might be able to find it online. But Mary Arquette says the struggle goes on to this day. In fact, some may question whether our communities will ever recover from the wars that we waged on the fur bearers. We certainly will never forget what happened, and to this day continue to have a special obligation to fur bearing animals and make amends for our past mistakes. And one of the things I just wanted to highlight here quickly to unpack it, and there's a number of other people I cite who say similar things, is if you said this outside of a native circle and other environmental circles, that sounds like you don't have enough hope. Right? Like there's a possibility this might not work out. And she's not saying it as a scare tactic either. She's just putting it plainly. And here Arquette's referring to the fur trade period, taking on responsibility for the environmental change, even though there was a lot of colonial imposition during that period. But actually saying, wait a minute, if we think about it, and the essay that this is quoted from is an essay about kinship. If you think about how badly kinship has been damaged, and here talking about humans and animals, that's going to take time to develop. And maybe the environmental destruction that's also happened is gotten to such a point where we're going to still experience those dangers, because it's going to take us a lot longer of a time to get back those kinship relationships, or to make kinship relationships anew, which is an important point in a context like the United States, in relation to Indigenous people. But this means actually that climate change maybe can't be dealt with urgently, that people shouldn't be urgent about getting to zero carbon. They should be urgent about repairing kinship. But the minute they let urgency for carbon zero overtake kinship, then they promote those false solutions, those energy transition solutions that, like I mentioned before, we're seeing through testimony and literature, are very damaging to Native people and perpetuate injustice, and in some ways make for a worse situation, even if other people in the world are experiencing the benefits of renewable energy. So I wanted to close with these points that within Native environmentalism, this is a commitment to kinship, and that it's not an abandonment of hope, and that actually for many of us, the urgency is to repair, reconcile, address kinship and equity and justice issues that are part of it, and not just the innovation aspects of technology and the implementation of renewables. All right, I look forward to our discussion.
Kyle, thank you so much. One of the places that spoke to me was as a parent of a very environmentally conscious 14-year-old boy. and trying to understand how he grapples with the nature of urgency and the nature of challenges and his view um, of the problems. And I think his sensibilities are very much intertwined with or very much intertwine the elements that you're describing, both the kinship elements and the technological elements. I'm waiting to see how he how he comes down and sorts that out. I see some questions already from Kiki and the blue hands. And please feel free to raise your hands and I'll help moderate that. But Kyle, if you see anybody flagging you down, you can call on them too.
Kyle, that was wonderful. I have missed hearing you speak and hearing your ideas, because with every single slide, I felt like I was in church. I wanted to say amen and hallelujah. And as you were talking, so many projects that I've been involved with, I was reframing in my head. So one, I just want to share with you because I think it's a really amazing illustration. And it makes me want to publish it, and I might be emailing you later. And the other is kind of a question about how we could do things differently. So one, around this idea of kinship and climate change, one of my students years ago did a study in Untitled, Alaska, where the Alaskan government was saying to this indigenous town, okay, the permafrost is going away, and you need to have your plan in place. And the plan is one where you must move. So just tell us how you're going to move. Like, all of this was prescribed. And when she went to talk to them, they're like, our plan's not to move anywhere. Our plan is to go up the hill. And what up the hill was that this town originally was kind of more on the plain or the tundra. And they began to develop up a hill where they all have family members and friends. And so as things became difficult lower down and there's better infrastructure up there, their plan was, we'll move up the hill to our relatives and our family. It's not something that's even recognized by the Alaskan government as a valid approach. Like, wasn't even part of the conversation, even though everyone in that village was like, we're moving up the hill. It was a saying, it meant something, almost like shots in the arm, we'll move up the hill. And in the midst of that, that project she did is kind of just showing how valid this approach could be. There was a major infrastructural accident in the town. I think it was some utility, maybe plumbing, where in the lower portions, no one had running water. And so in that moment, everyone moved up the hill. In those weeks until the infrastructure, it showed this is a valid approach. It was not being recognized by Alaska government at all. So just kind of an illustration of the power of that kinship network. But going back to kind of the start of your talk, and you're talking about renewables and this focus on innovation. And one of my other projects was tidal energy in Puget Sound, which did not go anywhere. And the tribal interest there around historical fishing rights was something that was never resolved, but was also never taken on as something serious. The response was always like, well, wherever you can have tidal energy, you can't fish anyway, so what's the concern? And what I find interesting is the approach to solving it was trying to invalidate their concern, as opposed to, it was always forward looking, like we got to move forward. And now as you're talking, I was like, why couldn't we have moved backwards? Why couldn't we have said, okay, tribal fishing rights as were given to you decades and 100 years ago may have different meanings now in an era of tidal energy. Let's revisit and reshape in conjunction with you what the resources in these waters are that are valuable and meaningful. And maybe that resource is energy. And if so, then how is this community that has traditionally had rights to it going to have rights to this? That wasn't even part of the conversation. Have you seen anyone who's willing to move backwards in time, revisit these things, and bring them into this modern space and say, well, what does that mean for us now? Is that happening anywhere?
Yeah, no, because what I typically see, and I appreciate your telling some of those stories, Dr. Jenkins, because they because they really testify to the experiences that I've had too. Where on the one hand, you have grassroots efforts, right, by tribes, by Native people, by other groups, where they're putting in practice these solutions. But then in these other cases where you have researchers, you have folks from like the U.S. government or others, they're still using these models of like infrastructure and stakeholder, or resource and stakeholder. And like on the infrastructure idea, I mean, we really need to get out of that mold that there's like the one infrastructure, which is whatever the technology it is. There's the proponents of the infrastructure, and then there's all the stakeholders that are circling around it in different ways. But when you look at actual like indigenous histories and knowledge of who they are, the last word I'd think about is a stakeholder, right? And whose infrastructure is it anyways, right? Everybody talks about infrastructure. It's a code word for industrial infrastructure. I mean, no different from how in your work you've grappled with different ways people talk about resources or natural resources. But what about indigenous infrastructure, right? The infrastructure that's tied to indigenous economies and ways of understanding landscapes and histories, and how today it factors in the actual infrastructure of tribes, given there's so many different ways in which infrastructure is defined within tribes today. What about that infrastructure and support for that infrastructure, right? And I think for a lot of people, that infrastructure has a kinship aspect to it, right? If a project isn't ultimately going to address issues tied to kinship and resilience, then it's going to end up with some of those, examples that you mentioned. And so, yeah, I haven't seen in terms of like projects led by governments or non-indigenous NGOs. I've worked as a facilitator or in other capacities on some of these projects. I just find a lot of frustrated people that are they're frustrated with these stakeholders, and they're not really able to grasp the historical aspects. They're not really to understand the grasp value, or how values can be have much more depth to them than just somebody's interest as it's tied to a particular infrastructural project. So anyways, those were some thoughts when I Kiki, when I was listening to your stories.
Thanks, Kyle. I could talk to you for forever, but I'm going to not, and I'm going to send you an email right now.
Hi, Kyle. This is
Other
Matt.
folks?
I was wondering
Go
if
ahead.
you could talk a little bit about the prior climate change events, that some of these stories about that you've called kinship stories, but stories about the lessons of consensus, accountability, reciprocity, and all of these kinds of things. Um, can you say more about those, and how you've learned about them? I mean, I'm through conversation with people like.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, I mean, for a lot of different Native folks, right? They like say for example, in my tribe, I mean, there's a lot of different storytelling traditions. Like for Potawatomi people, I mean, there's stories that you learn through just your regular family life. There are stories that you learn more formally through the tribe. If you for different communities, right, if you had the opportunity to be part of a tribally run school, it's part of the curriculum. But then there's also, I mean, a lot of people try to make use of some of the academic literature that recorded different stories. So it depends on the tribe, right? I mean, it depends on kind of overall that tribe situation, where the source of the stories are. There's some tribes that they've got some pretty amazing continuance in the orality of their tradition. And also there's a storytelling aspect too that's about the different indigenous languages. I mean, for whether somebody grew up speaking their language, or whether they have learned it subsequently or study it in different ways. Oftentimes, like the meaning of sentences or words or things like that are kind of aspects of narration. But it's kind of actually just a straightforward thing that so many stories, and I think you can find this probably in cultures all over the world. I mean, they speak to extreme weather events and floods, and or even people moving to new ecosystems and dealing with the different weather conditions, and then over the years the different climatic conditions. And so you just have stories about people responding to environmental change, where environmental change is an agent in the story. And so you see cases, right, where somebody experiences an environmental change, and they, what they were relying on for food before, they can't rely on it. So they try to find a new food source, but because they don't care about reciprocity with non-humans, they just try to do it on their own, and they try to come up with their own ideals, and each time they fail miserably. But then when they start listening to non-humans, they actually realize, well, wait a minute, there's another food source, and it's one that I don't have to use an abrupt technology to cultivate. I can just have a respect for the environment. But anyways, I mean, these stories is like, some of them just sound kind of just like simple stories, right? But I think that's what's important to note, right, is that while we might have been taught in different educational stories that these are just stories that have a moral component, if you actually look at what the stories say, they're about environmental change. And again, so many stories, I guess, in European or even American traditions, you could interpret them in that way as well. But the point I wanted to mention is that there has been an emphasis in Indigenous stories about emphasizing those environmental change aspects, and that the idea is that the way to be resilient, the way to be resilient is to first address the social fabric that may have been torn apart at the beginning of the story or in the middle of the story. And if you can address the social fabric issues, then you'll be prepared to do your best, no matter how bad the disruption is. And so that the emphasis, and I would argue this is a kinship point, the emphasis in a kinship relation, and it's not the only relations we have all sorts of other relationships, rights, contracts, obligations. But when you're focused on kinship and you're taking action, what makes an action right, what makes an action appropriate, is whether it's one that's conducive to strengthening overall responsiveness to environmental change. And so I think reciprocity is a good example of that, right? Reciprocity, if you have real reciprocity with somebody, it means you have an emotional sense that they have your back and you have their back, even if there's never a chance to reciprocate. You know that you've got that relationality. And so a lot of Indigenous stories talk about reciprocity, of people that fall out of reciprocity with animals, with fish, with others. And it's a process of the fallout of not having that reciprocity. And then depending on the story, how you repair that. And again, I would delineate that reciprocity is a very different type of relationship than a right. If you have a right, you're no better or worse prepared for a disruption. And it's interesting, a lot of Indigenous stories don't focus on rights. I mean, I know that rights, a lot of people talk about it as European or other type of construct. Yeah, that's true. But a right is just a type of entitlement. You can have that in any culture, right? And very few Indigenous stories I'm aware of talk about rights in that way. That, oh, if only somebody had the right entitlement, that they would have averted a disaster. So saying like reciprocity is very different, right? Everybody who's affected by climate change has rights. There's human rights, there's legal rights, there's rights within institutions we work in, rights in relation to our citizenship duties, but those rights don't do anything for our social fabric. If you have reciprocity, and there's other qualities too, that's a little bit different. If there's reciprocity within a society, we know, for example, that when times get really bad and people have to transition an economy from coal to solar and wind and biofuel and other things, that they're going to do so in a way in which the terms of economic exchange are reciprocal, in which you don't have the repetition of prior problematic hierarchies. So anyways, that's kind of how I interpret it. It's not the storytelling season for Anishinaabe folks right now, but I won't tell a specific story, but that's kind of my approach.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Yep.
Students in my Future of the Environment class use one of your readings and try to. This talk has been really helpful for sort of help thinking about how to engage with some of these themes better.
Okay, great. Glad the work is of support.
Hi, Kyle, that was great. I feel like I have so many questions that we could go into, but I wanted to actually pick up on something. So I'm mixed race, I'm Indigenous, and my tribal relations are Apache of Coahuila and Chihuahua, northern Mexico. So we've gone through 3 layers of colonialism, settler, and erasure, for that matter, between Spanish, Mexican, and Americans, and something I had never really thought about before. I mean, our people were originally probably ultimate in the definition of sustainability in terms of being nomadic, of truly flowing with the seasons. Infrastructure was one that was one with nature versus, the other way around. And then of course, that was all changed by the Spanish in particular. But one of the things that you said in this last conversation with Matt that sparked a question is rights from a perspective of not a legal right or even a moral right, but a right, RITE, in terms of rite of passage. I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, how much, I don't know that I've ever heard really anyone, Indigenous anyway, talk about it this way necessarily, but I'm curious your thoughts about, what is happening within. We know that there is a human element to this specific change that's going on right now with activities, but on the other hand, is this nothing, going back to our Indigenous timeline and what you presented, is this more a rite of passage, so to speak, for the earth and for the peoples? Is it, what is your thoughts on that in terms of putting climate change today into that context of a rite of passage that is happening because it's happening, period?
Yeah, thanks for your question and your points. I think this is why so if we just take kind of some of the narration that you gave, I mean, I think this is why a lot of different indigenous perspectives can be important, because is there a fact that climate change must necessarily be a rite of passage? Well, no, but just now, right, when you presented that idea to me, and I thought about, okay, well, what's the, what are the lessons there? Is it a rite of passage? Well, instead of like a lot of my non-native colleagues do, they immediately want to figure out whether that is true or false. But let's just actually run with the idea. So if it's a rite of passage, and we can all have this conversation. If it's a rite of passage, is it a rite of passage from and to? And so let's get to the bottom of that. And so then that opens up a sense of history, right? If it's a rite of passage, then maybe social relationships across humans, with humans and the environment, have changed to a certain point, that there has to be this and it depends on what kind of rite of passage it is, of course, right? But there has to be this transition point. And so there, if we think about it, well, what's the before, and then what are we going for? That, I think, immediately moves us beyond some of the perspectives that are just looking at efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change as ones that are solely about problem and problem aversion, right? There's a problem, there's a crisis, let's avert it. And one that actually thinks about, well, how did we get to the crisis? And is it really a crisis about the fact that people a long time ago didn't know that those technologies were going to increase greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? Is that really what the crisis is about? Is it that powerful, naive people just didn't figure out soon enough what the implications were? It's not that that's false. That's certainly an element to it. But I think an approach like you're talking about also gets people thinking about the fact that if we really look deeply at history, we can just think about the history of the United States, it's really not that easy to differentiate the types of justifications that previous colonists and settlers gave for very bad things, whether it was the hydropower and irrigation dams that displaced native people, whether it was the allotment of tribal lands, the boarding schools. All of these things were intended to avert crises. There's a problem aversion, and people got very sanctimonious about it. They got very heroic about it, and they based their whole lives on trying to solve these problems. But then when we look back on it, we understand what the implications were. And so as a rite of passage, then, what is it a rite of passage from? Well, it's the fact that, we haven't actually, we've had, we've had so much repeated colonialism as well as other forms of power, that it's taken a lot of people to the bone, right? And we're not at a point where we can actually withstand continued repetition, right? And so in that way, I think that way of framing it does open up those discussions. But that's why I think is the conversations that are important to have when we actually look at other ways of narrating climate change, is how it opens up the experiences of other people whose voices are oftentimes excluded. So anyways, thanks for your framing and your ideas.
Thanks so much.
So we're at the top of the hour, and as is our custom, I would like to thank everybody